Hi everyone, this is the second lesson of Managerial Economics, that is indifference curve analysis and its applications. First, we will try to understand what is an indifference curve. So indifference curve, the basic definition of an indifference curve is that it is a curve that shows the two combinations or different bundles of two products that provide the same amount of utility or satisfaction to the consumer. So if we draw an indifference curve, we assume that there are only two products produced in the economy, similar to the production possibility curve. Here, let's assume the good is good Y and good X. So here we can create different bundles or combinations of these two products. Let's say 1 unit of good Y and 1 unit of good X, 2 units of good Y and 2 units of good X. Likewise, you can create different bundles or combinations of these two products. So let's say we take a consumer in the economy. So this consumer perceives different utility levels or satisfactions for each of these bundles. And according to this consumer, some of these bundles provides him the same amount of satisfaction or utility. So if we combine those bundles that provides him the same amount of utility, we end up with a curve like this. And this curve is known as the indifference curve. So there's a property in indifference curves that indifference curves so we can draw. So through each bundle provides a utility. So in that sense, there's an indifference curve going through each of these bundles, the two products. Likewise, there's an indifference curve going through each of these bundles. So these indifference curves cannot intercept each other because according to a consumer, the same bundle cannot have two different utilities, two different levels of satisfaction. So they cannot intercept each other. And the other thing is, generally, a human being would like to consume more and more. The satisfaction would increase if they have more compared to when they have less. So indifference curve away from the origin indicates bundles that have higher amount of units. So in that case, indifference curve that goes away from the origin have higher level of satisfaction. So when it comes to the shape of this indifference curve, a general indifference curve is convex to the origin and it's downward sloping. The reason for this is the law of diminishing marginal utility. Utility is the satisfaction the consumer gains by consuming a certain product. Utility කියන්නේ තෘප්තිය consumer කට ලැබෙන යම්කිසි භාණ්ඩයක් පරිභෝජනය කිරීමෙන්. And the marginal utility is the extra or the additional amount of utility that the consumer gains by consuming an additional unit of the considered product. So when we draw the utility curve, we have the total utility on the y-axis and the amount of the units of the considered goods consumed on the x-axis. Let's say the amount of units consumed from good X. So total utility, according to the law of marginal utility, it increases initially with the amount of units consumed. And then after a certain level, it drops down, it diminishes. So this scenario is known as the law of diminishing marginal utility. This phenomenon is known as the law of diminishing marginal utility. Here, the marginal utility, that is the extra utility the consumer gains by consuming an additional unit of the considered product, keeps on decreasing after a certain level. So if we take a practical scenario, if you eat, okay, there are two assumptions here. That is, first, the consumer consumes identical units of the same product. So if we take uh, each unit of the X product, those are identical. There's no change in them. And we also assume that the consumer consumes these units one after the other simultaneously without taking a break. So continuously he consumes. So if we take a practical scenario, if we eat an ice cream, so in the second ice cream, when we consume the second ice cream, we will get a higher amount of utility compared to the first, ice cream. But if we continuously keep on consuming the same ice cream, then after a certain level, we will feel vomitish, kind of. So that is the idea behind this law of diminishing marginal utility. So if we apply this to understand the shape of the indifference curve, so the shape of an indifference curve or shape of any curve is determined by their slope. So indifference curves, slope is convex to the origin and it's downward sloping. The reason for this is the law of diminishing marginal utility. So in here, the indifference curve, the slope of the indifference curve is known as the marginal rate of substitution. From the name, you can understand it is the amount of units that a consumer is willing to sacrifice in order to obtain an extra unit, an additional unit from the other good. So in this curve, it is the amount of units that the consumer would like to sacrifice from good Y in order to obtain an extra unit, an additional unit of good X. So MRS, marginal rate of substitution along an indifference curve, keeps on decreasing. That means the amount of units that the consumer would prefer to sacrifice from good Y to obtain an additional unit of good X keeps on decreasing. Why is that? Here you can understand the reason is when the consumer keeps on getting more and more of a good X, the utility, the marginal utility, the consumer gains from consuming an additional unit of good X keeps on decreasing. So in that sense, the consumer would not like to sacrifice good Y in order to consume an additional unit of good X after a certain level. So that's the reason why the indifference curve is like this. So even in a practical scenario, you would like to have more of what you have less. Then there are two cases where the indifference curve is not convex to the origin. And those two scenarios is in a perfect substitute good or in a perfect complementary good. So in perfect substitute, according to the consumer, if he thinks of two products as perfect substitutes, that means he considers that one of those products, those two goods can replace each other perfectly. So he wouldn't mind getting either of them. He doesn't need both. He would be happy with having at least one of them. So if you take Coca-Cola and Pepsi-Cola, C is Coca-Cola, P is Pepsi-Cola. So the indifference curve will be shaped like this. If you perceive it to, if you perceive them to be perfect substitutes, it will be shaped like this, because as you can see in the general indifference curve, it is not intercepting the origins. However, in here, it is. Why is that? It is because the consumer would not mind having 10 units of Pepsi Coca-Cola or 10 units of Coca-Cola, because they are perfect substitutes. And the margin rate of substitution is constant. Then if we take a perfect complementary good, a perfect complementary good is the consumer, going to consumer, he wants both of them to feel satisfied. If we have one and not the other, he will not be satisfied, because they are perfect complements according to him. So let's say the consumer perceives a cup of yogurt and the spoons you get. So if he gets 2 yogurts, let's draw the difference curve for such goods. Let's say he gets 1 yogurt and a 1 spoon. His satisfaction level is shown by this indifference curve. However, let's say he gets 2 yogurts, but still 1 spoon. As you can see, satisfaction level has not increased. The indifference curve is still the same. So if he wants to increase his satisfaction, he needs both of them. 2 units of each, or 3 units of each. So satisfaction level to increase, he needs to increase both of those products. Okay, then we will go to the budgetary constraint. So if you have, so a consumer would want, as I said earlier, if the consumer has more of both the products, the satisfaction level would increase. So you would want to increase your satisfaction level. That means you would want to consume more. But you cannot do that. There's something called a budgetary constraint. Your income level is fixed. You cannot be purchasing products that are above your income level. So in a consumer budgetary constraint, let me share the screen first. Okay, so this document, the note, has already been uploaded to the drive as well as to the academic materials group. So in here, let's go to the budgetary constraint part. Okay, so this curve is showing the consumer budget line, or the budgetary constraint. Here, as you can see, let's say the consumer's income is 10,000 as a fixed income of 10,000, and the price of good Y, a unit of good Y, is 100, and the price of a unit of good X is 50. So in that case, the maximum amount he could buy from good Y is 100, and the maximum amount you can buy from good X is 200. So the budgetary constraint is a line drawn by connecting all the combinations of the 2 products that the consumer can buy using his income level. So if the income increases, the amount of units he could buy increases, and therefore the consumer budget line will shift. The entire consumer budget line will shift to the right side, like here, in here. When M increases, that means the consumer income increases. As you can see, the entire budget line have shifted to the right side because he can buy more of each good. However, if the price of a one good increases, then the price decreases. Then a shift would occur only on this side, the axis where the price has changed. In here, the price of good X has decreased, and therefore the curve have shifted to the right side only in terms of good X and not good Y. I have cut off this part because it's not what this formula whatever implies. So the slope of the consumer budgetary constraint is usually known as the marginal rate of exchange. Marginal rate of exchange, you can get an idea. It is the willingness of the consumer to exchange the other good for the other, for another. So in here, the consumer budget line is provided in terms of quantity. So in similar to the indifference curve, we are saying how willing the consumer is to sacrifice good Y to consume an experiment of good X, but in terms of money value. So in order to consume good X, experiment of good X, how much the portion of the price of good Y that the consumer has to sacrifice. So in here, the price of good X is 50 and the price of good Y is 100. So the consumer would have to only sacrifice half, 0.5 in terms of portion of the price of good Y in order to consume a unit of good X. Okay, then. So within this budgetary constraint, how can the consumer maximize his utility level? As you can see in this diagram, there's indifference curve. I said indifference curve. There's an indifference curve going through each combination of the two products because each product have a utility level. So the indifference curve that is tangent, the point of the indifference curve, of an indifference curve where it is tangent to the budgetary constraint, is the utility maximization point. You can argue that why we take the tangent point and why we are not taking a point where the indifference curve is intercepting the budgetary constraint. So as you can see, the indifference curve 2 is intercepting the budgetary constraint at 2 points. However, indifference curve 2 have a lesser utility compared to indifference curve 3. So why would you not go for indifferent to the point tangent where indifference curve 3 and indifference curve, the budgetary constraint is tangent? Sorry. So if you can obtain higher utility from indifference curve 3 and you can actually purchase that bundle of goods, why would you settle for somewhere where the indifference curve 2 is intercepting the budgetary constraint? Because indifference curve 2 has a lesser amount of utility compared to indifference curve 3. So there's no point of settling there. So if you want to increase your utility, you have to go for the highest indifference curve where the budgetary constraint is touching. So at such a point, in the utility maximization point, the slope of the budgetary constraint and the slope of the indifference curve, that is marginal rate of substitution and the marginal rate of exchange, they are equal. Okay, so MRS, the marginal rate of substitution, can be also indicated like this: marginality of x divided by marginality of y, because the slope is like that because of diminishing marginality, because of the trade-off between the marginality of the two products. So marginal rate of substitution is how much the consumer is willing to sacrifice good y to consume good x. And so you can show it in terms of marginal utility like this. So if the marginal, as long as the marginal utility the consumer obtains from good X is higher than the marginal utility of the consumer gets from good Y, the consumer is willing to sacrifice good Y. But if the marginal utility the consumer gains from good X is lesser than the good Y, then the willingness decreases, and therefore the MRS is diminishing along an indifference curve. So if we draw it like, if we take the MRS like that, then we can equate it to the marginal rate of exchange. Then we do cross multiplication and end up with this. So basically, the utility maximization point is where the marginal utility a consumer gains by $1 spent on each of the two products is equal. So the marginal utility the consumer gains by spending $1 or a certain currency unit on good X, and the marginal utility the consumer gains by spending a certain amount of currency on good Y, they are both similar at the utility maximization point. Then we are going for individual consumer demand. So the individual consumer demand curve can be derived using the indifference curve. Likewise, so the demand curve shows the different quantities that the consumer is willing to purchase at different price levels. So we can get the utility maximization points for each price level of good X. And if we draw a line connecting the prices as well as those the quantities that provides utility maximization points, then we will end up with the individual consumer demand curve. So there are two reasons for the law of demand. Law of demand is when price increases, usually the demand for a certain good, the quantity you demand decreases. That is the law of demand. So there are two reasons for that. That is the substitution effect and the income effect. Substitution effect is when the price increases, some of the consumers will shift to a substitute product, and the income effect is when the price increases, the real income of the consumer decreases, and therefore the consumer, even if he's willing, he cannot purchase the same amount of quantity once purchased, and he has to reduce the quantity demanded. This is the income effect and substitution effect. So these effects can be denoted by an indifference curve. We are taking how we can do it for a normal good, an inferior good, and a given good. Because in a normal good, both income and substitution effect are going towards the law, agreeing with the law of demand, while in inferior goods, the substitution effect is in both inferior goods and given goods, the substitution effect goes along with the law of demand. However, the income effect goes against the law of demand. Because in inferior goods and given goods, we assume that they are not that much of quality and the price is low. So when the real income is, when the price is increasing and the real income is reducing, because of that, you would, however, because since that is the good you can purchase at a low price, you will have to increase the quantity of that good, because you cannot, that's the only thing you can purchase within your budget, within your income level, although your real income has reduced. That is the reason. So normal goods, in normal good, we can denote the income effect and substitution effect like this. So in here, the price of good X has increased. And therefore, the budgetary line has shifted from the good X side towards the origin, and from BL1 to BL2. And the indifference curve has also moved towards the origin. It hasn't moved towards the origin. The consumer has to move to a lower level of indifference curve eventually. So first, the substitution effect. So even when the price is increasing, the consumer would like to, so here in an indifference curve, as I said earlier, we are assuming there are only two goods in the economy. So the consumer would have to substitute good X for good Y or good Y for good X. Those are the only substitution options the consumer would have. So the consumer would like to stick in the same indifference curve. He would like to have the same amount of utility even when the price of good X is increasing. And therefore, what he will do is he will try to reduce the amount he is buying from good X and try to increase the amount he is buying from good Y. So he's trying to substitute good X for a good Y and stay in the same utility curve. He's trying to substitute the product that have a higher price for the product that have a lower price and stay in the same utilities. However, that is what we can, the substitution effect is shown from point A to B. So this point B is taken by drawing a parallel line to the second budget line. The parallel lines have been drawn, and where it is connecting, intercepting the first indifference curve, and that's how we get point B. So from point A to point B, it shows the substitution effect. And however, as you can see, you do not have the income necessary to purchase point B, the bundle at point B. So you have to move towards point C. You have to settle for a lower level of satisfaction because you do not have the income. So from point B and to point C, that is the real income, not the real income, that is the income effect. Because you do not have the real income, the means to purchase that bundle, the bundle B, you have to move to bundle C. From point B to C, it indicates the income effect. So the combination of those two effects are known as the total effect. So then, for inferior goods. For inferior goods, the substitution effect goes along with the law of demand. However, the income effect goes against the law of demand. However, when the balance of these, the total effect are not going against the law of demand, similar to the given goods, the balance is going towards along with the law of demand. So that means the substitution effect is higher in inferior goods compared to the income effect. So in this diagram, the same thing has happened. The price of good X has increased, so the budget line has shifted from the good X side to the origin. And in the same manner, from A to B, it indicates the substitution effect, and from B to C, it indicates the income effect. So as you can see, the gap from A to B is higher compared to the gap from B to C. That means the substitution effect is higher than the income effect. So when you are drawing this, it is important to remember this and place point B and C when you're drawing the indifference curve and the budget lines. Remember to draw them and place these points so it's sort of shows this effect, the difference in these effects. So in given goods, the substitution effect agrees with the law of demand. However, the income effect is higher. And income effect goes against the law of demand. So that's why in given goods, when the price increases, the quantity increases. So as you can see, the gap between point A and B, that is the substitution effect, is lower compared to the gap between point B and C. That gap is higher. So the balance, the total effect, goes against the law of demand. The quantity has increased. So let's go to the exercises. So in here, suppose the marginal utility of the last unit of X consumed is 40 and the marginal utility of the last unit of Y consumed is 30. The prices of good Y and X are $4 and $2 respectively. Should the consumer increase or decrease consumption of good X? Explain carefully. So in here, we have to get that formula. The utility maximization point. Formula for utility maximization point. So if the consumer has already reached the utility maximization point, then he does not have to increase or decrease the consumption of a good X. But if the consumer has not reached that utility maximization point, he would have either have to increase or decrease the consumption of good X. So in here, the utility that the consumer gets, the marginal utility the consumer gains from $1 spent on good X is 10, and the marginal utility the consumer gains by spending $1 on a product Y is 15. That means the consumption of good X has to be decreased because the consumption of good Y is higher. So if we keep on increasing the good Y, this gap will increase. The utility, the marginal the gain from $1 spent on good X will keep on decreasing if we increase the consumption of good X. So we have to decrease it to come to a level where $1 spent on each of the product is equal. So if you ask the same question in terms of good Y, if we have to increase or decrease the consumption of good Y, what we have to do is increase the consumption of good Y because we already have a higher consumption in good Y, higher utility for $1 spent on good Y. That means in order to come to a level where both are equal to 10, then we have to increase the consumption of good Y. Then the second question, food stamps versus cash. Here the two goods are the other products that you can buy from cash other than the food stamps, and we have the food stamps. So there are three government policies. Those are no support. The government provides 200 worth of food stamps, and the government provides 200 worth of cash. So we have to indicate each of these government policies through an indifference curve. So first, no support. And if you have no support, you have the prices and prices of the other goods given as 1 rupee, and the prices of food stamps given as 2, and the fixed income level is 200 rupees. So the budget line for this first scenario where you have no support is given as the BL1, budget line 1. And the utility maximization point is where the indifference curve 1 is tangent to the budget line 1. Then the consumer gains 200 worth of food stamps from the government. So then, in the first scenario, first we are going to see the same three policies. What is going to happen when the consumer is indifferent between the preference of the consumer is indifferent between both of these products. And next we are going to see what happens when the consumer's preference, consumer prefer one good over another. So in the first case, where the consumer is indifferent between the two products in terms of preference, in the next policy, the second policy, now the consumer gains 200 worth of food stamps. Then we have the indifference curve denoted by the red line. So only the food stamps have increased. So the income level has not increased, and therefore the amount of other goods you can buy from the income is still 200, but the food stamps, now you can obtain 200 units of food stamps, another 200 rupees of food stamps, and a food stamp, the price of food stamp is 2 rupees. So additional to 100 units maximum you have obtained here from 200 to 100, an addition of 100 units. Then the third policy, you get cash 200. So both now you have both. You can increase the consumption of both of these products. So the budget line have now moved to the black color budget line, that is budget line 2. And you can increase your utility level. You can go to a higher utility level. Then we have the situation where the consumer have a preference over other goods compared to the food stamps. So in that case, as you can see, the indifference curve is moving towards the other good and away from the food stamps, because the consumer would like to have the satisfaction level would increase when the consumer gets more of the other goods. Then, as you can see in the same way, the first scenario, we have the BL1 and the indifference curve 1. Then in the second scenario, the amount of other goods you can purchase is still 200, limited to 200. This is the red line. And this other line. But the food stamps have increased. So when the consumer has such a preference towards the other goods, and then the consumer gets අයියෝ කනවනේ ඉතින්. So in here, if the consumer gets 200 worth of food stamps, now he doesn't have to spend any of his income on food stamps, and he can spend on what he actually likes. That is other goods. So he's spending all of his income on other goods. Now, you can see the point where the red budgetary line touches the indifference curve too, where it is tangent. Then the next thing, the next policy, where the consumer gains 200 worth of cash from the government. Now he can increase the purchase of both of the goods. However, his preference goes to the other goods, so he's spending the income, most of his income, and what the government gave on the other goods. Then we're going to see what happens when tariffs and transfer payments are given by the government. So in the first scenario, we have the normal scenario. And then the government taxes 100% on shelter. So if the government taxes 100%, that means the price have to increase by 100%. So here, before the tax, price of 1 unit of shelter was $1, and now it's $2. And then the amount he can buy, the maximum amount he can buy from shelter is now 8. And still the amount of food he can buy, the maximum amount is 16. Then the consumer gets a transfer payment. Still the tax is there, but now he gets a transfer payment of $8. So now we are going to add this $8 to the income. How much he can buy from, the maximum amount he can buy from each good have changed. And because of the addition transfer amount of $8, now the consumer have the ability, you can see at the budget line have moved. The consumer have the ability to buy a maximum amount of 24 units from food now with the transfer payment and the income level he has. And from shelter, still the tax is there. So the price of shelter inclusive of tax is $2, and the maximum amount he can buy from shelter is 12 with the addition of transfer payment.